Bedtime Reading, Moby Dick. Chapter 1. A Strange Bedmate. Call me Ishmael. I worked as a schoolmaster, but sometimes I would feel that I needed a bit of change. So, whenever I felt a little down from life, I would stop my work and head for the sea. There was something about the sea that brought back and restored my spirit, my drive in life. For this I could always count on the sea. Don't think that I'd go aboard a ship, traveling as a passenger. No, my way of escaping the reality of my hometown of Manhattan, New York, was going to sea as a plain, ordinary seaman. In this way, I didn't have to pay to be aboard a ship. In fact, whomever I worked for would pay me. Also, I liked the exercise of being a seaman. Most importantly, I was able to travel to faraway places and experience things that I would never experience if I stayed in my hometown. Most of the time, I would sign up on a merchant ship, traveling from port to port. However, this time I decided to go aboard a whaling ship. These ships always interested me because working on one was often dangerous work, and the seamen on whaling ships were always an interesting and varied lot of men. I decided to go aboard a ship that would sail from the original home of whaling in America, Nantucket. It is an island off the coast of Massachusetts. In order to reach there from Manhattan, I had to first go to New Bedford and then take a small boat to Nantucket. It was a terribly cold Saturday night in December when I arrived in New Bedford. Also, I received some bad news. I had just missed the last boat for Nantucket, and the next one wasn't leaving until Monday morning. I did not have a lot of money, for I always traveled with little money, so I hadn't counted on the extra cost of staying 2 nights in New Bedford. Still, I didn't have any other choice. I began to look around the town for a cheap hotel. Most of the ones that I passed seemed too happy and nice for the money I had. So I kept on walking, even though there was an icy wind blowing hard on my face. Finally, near the dock, I saw an old, unfixed hotel with many windows. There was a light coming from inside. The sign of the hotel made a creaking noise as it moved in the wind. On the sign was a picture of a water spray with the words, "The Spouter Inn, Peter Coffin," under the picture. The front door of the hotel was so old it was falling apart. The door was shaking in the strong wind. Not what I had in mind, I thought, but it's far better than being outside on this freezing and windy night. When I entered the hotel, the first thing I saw was a dark and discouraging picture of a sinking ship and a whale. There were all kinds of frightening weapons, clubs, spears, whaling lances, and harpoons covered in rust that hung on one wall. Most interesting, and quite imaginative as well, I thought, was the entrance to the bar. It was formed by the top skeleton of a whale's mouth. This made it look like the bartender, whose old dark face was covered in lines, was working and mixing drinks from inside a whale's fierce jaws. The landlord told me that he didn't have any more rooms to use, but when I told him I had no other place to go before Monday morning, he told me I could share a bed with a harpooner, that is, a man who harpooned whales. I didn't like the idea of sharing a bed, especially with a harpooner. Harpooners are known for being fierce and wild men. Still, I knew that sharing rooms was quite common in hotels in small towns and that I would probably be quite safe. Seeing that I had no other choice, I told the landlord I would be happy with half of a good man's blanket. I ate a simple dinner that night. I was waiting for the harpooner to arrive during my dinner, but he did not appear. I was really hoping to meet him before going to bed, for I did not look forward to sleeping in a strange bed in a strange town with a total stranger. This was especially true because I knew from experience that harpooners were usually rough in nature. As I sat at the bar, I kept a worried eye on the door. Yet, even after midnight, there was still no sign of him. Finally, I got up and asked the landlord where my bed partner was. "Where is he?" I asked. But the landlord only shook his head in reply. "What sort of man is he to be staying out so late?" "Usually he's the man who leaves the earliest. You know, the kind of man who believes the early bird catches the worm," explained the landlord. "But I guess tonight he must be out trying to sell his goods. He must be having some trouble selling his head." "His what?" I shouted. "Be easy there," said the landlord. "This harpooner is from the South Seas. While there he collected a lot of treated and fixed shrunken heads from New Zealand. These are great things of curiosity, you know. He's managed to sell all of them but one, and I told him it wouldn't be a good thing to be selling shrunken human heads about the streets tomorrow. Tomorrow is Sunday, and a good many folks will be going to church. They'll get mighty angry if they see him trying to sell one of those." "Well, it sounds like he could be a dangerous man," I cried. "He always pays," said the landlord, lighting a candle. "And that's the only business I care about. Now come along and I'll take you to your room." There was an odd-looking old chest, like the ones that can be found on ships, standing in the middle of my small, cold room. In the middle was a bed that was big enough for 4 harpooners. There wasn't any other furniture but a rough shelf and an old wooden chair underneath it. A seaman's bag was on the floor, and a tall, dangerous-looking harpoon stood beside the bed. I couldn't sleep for a while after the landlord left. At last, I fell into a light sleep. Suddenly, heavy footsteps in the hallway woke me up, and I saw a thin ray of light come into the room from the open door. "Lord protect me," I thought. "It must be the head seller." I lay perfectly still, not wanting to be seen by the head seller. I watched a dark figure stuff the horrible New Zealand head back into the sea bag. He placed his heavy sea coat on a chair. Then he reached into the sea bag and took out what looked like to me to be an Indian axe. I wasn't able to see the man's face in the dark, but after a while I was able to make out his features. When I did, I froze. His face was dark purple in color, and all over it were large blackish-looking squares. When he took off his hat, I almost cried out in surprise. There was no hair on his head, no hair except a small twisted scalp knot, which is a piece of long hair left in the center when the rest was shaved off. To me, his bald purple head looked like an old skull that had been buried for years. The stranger was standing between me and the door. If he hadn't been, I would have run out of the room, frightened out of my mind. But fear had made me unable to move. So I just lay there waiting, silently looking at the rest of him. The top half of his body, his chest, arms, and back, was covered in the same dark spots like his face. On his legs were tattoos or ink drawings on the skin. In the darkness, they looked like a row of dark green frogs running up young palm trees. The stranger then reached over to his heavy sea coat on the chair and from the pocket he took out a little statue that was bent over at the back. It was a worshipping statue. Then he took out a handful of small pieces of wood, a candle, and a bit of ship's cake. These he placed on the shelf above the fireplace. He lit a small fire. I guessed it was a sacrificial or holy flame for his religion. Then he burned the cake and made a polite offering of it to the little statue. Then he began to pray. His eyes moved nervously in an unnatural manner, and he made strange noises in his throat. He was worshipping this figure in some kind of religious ceremony. I could only lay there, watching in amazement. Chapter 2. A Friendship Forever. The stranger finally put out the little fire and placed the small statue back in his coat pocket. I wanted to speak out, to say something to let him know I was there. But before I could, he quickly placed the axe-shaped thing between his teeth, brought a lit match up to it, and blew out a huge cloud of tobacco smoke. Then he quickly jumped into bed. I finally made a noise, and he started in surprise. But I couldn't say anything and rolled toward the wall. He started shouting and waving his axe pipe around, spreading small bits of hot ash all over the bed. I was totally afraid that he would cut me with a knife or set the bed on fire with his pipe. "Who be you?" he yelled. "Speak, or damn it, I kill you!" Jumping out of bed as fast as I could, I cried out for the landlord. Thank heaven he quickly arrived, holding a light in his hand. "Now, don't be afraid, I tell you," he said, smiling from the open door. "Queequeg won't hurt one hair on your head." "How come you didn't tell me the harpooner was a human eater?" I screamed. "I thought you'd know, being a schoolmaster, that head sellers are also human eaters. Didn't I tell you earlier that he was out selling heads?" He turned to Queequeg and said, "Look here, you. This man sleeps with you, you understand?" "I understand," Queequeg answered. He continued to puff away at his pipe. Then he politely pulled the bed cover back for me to get into bed. I looked at him good and hard. I realized that under all the paint and tattoos, he was probably a good normal man. I was sure he probably thought I was just as odd-looking, and he probably had as much reason to be afraid of me as I had to be afraid of him. "Okay, landlord," I said. "But could you ask him to put the Indian axe away and not smoke in bed? I don't really like going up in fire." Queequeg quickly agreed and rolled over to one side of the bed, as if to say, "Don't worry. You don't have anything to fear from me." "Good night, landlord," I said, "and thanks for your help." Early the next morning, Queequeg politely said that he would dress first and let me enjoy the room by myself. I realized that my roommate was the polite one, while I was being the rude one. Still, I couldn't help looking in wonder as he got dressed. He first put on his tall, full hat, and then got back under the blanket to put on his boots. After this, he got out of bed to put on his pants and shirt. Next, he took a large wet piece of soap and began to soap up his face for a shave. I wondered about the kind of knife he would have. I soon found out, much to my surprise. He took the head of the harpoon off its long pole, sharpened it against his boot, and began to shave away at his beard. At the time, I was amazed by this, but later on I learned how sharp these steel harpoon heads are kept. I was expecting to hear exciting sea stories from all the experienced whalers during breakfast. But to my disappointment, they were all silent and shy. Queequeg was pretty busy, though. even though he didn't eat any of the hot bread or coffee. He had brought his harpoon with him to the table. Now and then he would reach the harpoon across the breakfast table and spear one piece of beef after another. The beef was hardly cooked, which I imagined was right for his taste. After breakfast I was alone in the public room with him. I watched him pick up a heavy book from the table. Then he started to slowly count in his strange language how many pages were in the book. Every time he finished counting 50 pages, he would stop and whistle in surprise. Then he'd continue counting. I couldn't help but wonder why he wasn't friendlier with the other seamen who were staying at the hotel. But I have to say I also liked him for it. I realized that he was a man 20,000 miles away from his homeland of New Zealand. He couldn't have been in a place more foreign to him than if he'd landed on another planet. Even though he was so far away from his home, he still was able to keep himself relaxed and comfortable, happy with his own company. I felt myself quite attracted to him. I decided to move my bench close and try my best to talk to him. I didn't have to speak first, though, for he soon asked me if we would be sharing a room together again that night. When I answered yes, he looked quite pleased, as if I'd shown he was a good person by not changing to a different room. Then I tried to explain the book whose pages he was counting, what printing was, and what the pictures in it meant. Since I also liked tobacco, I suggested that we should smoke a little. He took out his tobacco sack and axe pipe. We quietly sat passing the pipe back and forth between ourselves. When we had finished the pipe, he pressed his forehead to mine, held me around my waist, and announced that we were married. At first I was a little shocked, but I learned that in his country's language he meant that we were now best friends, and that he would even die for me if he had to. I was deeply touched by his feelings. Here in America, we don't often trust people so quickly. Close friendships take a long time to form. As for the case of this kind, wild man, the old rules of America just didn't matter. After dinner and another friendly smoke, he gave me his shrunken head as a present. Then he took his tobacco sack and, looking under the tobacco, took out about $30 worth of silver. He divided the money into 2 halves and told me that half of the money was mine. I tried to refuse his offer, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He picked up the silver money and put it in my coat pocket. Next, he took out the little bent statue I had seen him use last night in his ritual. He could only explain himself in his own language, which of course I didn't understand. So he made signs to let me know he wanted me to join him in his religious ceremony. This created a problem for me. As a good Christian, I knew worshipping statues was against my religion. But then I started to think about my God. I knew that God didn't want us Christians to worship other gods, but it didn't seem possible that He, the mighty ruler of all heaven and earth, would be mad about a little piece of wood. Also, didn't I learn in church that God wants us to do things to make other men happy, just as we want them to make us happy? I decided to light the fire and then offered the statue some burnt cake, and bowed once or twice. After this, I went to bed. Queequeg was already awake when I woke up early the next morning. He began to tell me about his life. "I was born on Kokovoko, a small island in the South Pacific," he explained. "My father was king, and my uncle was high priest of the island. I will become king when my old father dies. But first, I wanted to see the Christian world so I can bring back great improvements to my people. So, when a whaling ship came to Kokovoko, I begged, begged the captain to take me on the ship. The captain said no, but I would not give up. I rowed my boat to the narrow place that ships must enter. Then I put a hole in the boat so that it sunk in the water. After that, I climbed up the side of the ship and threw myself on deck. Again, the captain said no, but when he saw how serious I, the chief's son, was, he decided to let me stay on board. There, I learned whaling. Are you going to return home soon and to take over your father's position as king? I asked. I watched how other sailors behaved and learned that even Christians could be evil and wicked, he said. Now, I feel that I cannot carry on the line of 30 pure kings that were before me. One day, I will feel clean and pure again. What are you planning to do now? I asked. I want to sail again, he said strongly. I was also going to join a whaling ship, and this is why I am here in Nantucket, I told him. Then, because you are my friend, I will go and sign on to same ship. This made me happy for 2 reasons. First, Queequeg was my friend, and second, he was an experienced harpooner. I could think of no better teacher for me on my first whaling voyage. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Captain Ahab. The next morning I borrowed a cart and we brought our things to the dock where the ships were. He told me a story about the first time he had seen a cart. He didn't know what to do with it, so he tied his sea chest to it and carried both the cart and the sea chest on his shoulders. Didn't people look at you? Didn't they laugh? I asked. People all laugh in different ways, he replied. I'll tell you another story. Once a sea captain from a Christian country came to visit Kokovoko Island. We told him to come along to the wedding of my sister. The high priest gave the captain a big bowl of coconut juice. The captain was to put his fingers into it so as to bless the coconut juice before giving it to the other guests. The captain wasn't too smart. He started to wash his hands in the coconut juice. What you think now? Do you think that my people did not laugh? Yes, Queequeg, I said. I guess they did. We had reached the Moss, which was a small ship sailing from New Bedford to Nantucket. When we came on board, some of the passengers started to make fun of Queequeg. One passenger shouted, "Uncivilized!" to him, which made Queequeg particularly angry. Dropping his harpoon, Queequeg picked up the rude man and threw him high into the air. As the rude man was coming down, Queequeg gently hit the man's back in the middle of his fall, which caused the fellow to land on his feet. Queequeg then turned around and calmly lit his axe pipe as if nothing had happened. The man, however, was greatly upset and ran to complain to the captain. The captain came running towards us. "What in thunder do you mean by a trick like that? You might have killed this fellow," he shouted. "What did he say?" asked Queequeg calmly. "The captain said you near killed that fellow there," I said, also quite calmly, pointing to the shaking, frightened man. Suddenly Queequeg's face was filled with hatred. "Kill him?" he shouted. "He is just a small fish. I don't kill a small fish. I kill big whales." "I'll kill you, human eater," shouted the captain, "if you try any tricks again. So watch out, because I'm keeping my eyes on you." However, it was the captain who had to watch out. Something had gone wrong when the mainsail was being raised. The boom, or long, low pole that kept the sail stretched out, started to swing from side to side. It was making huge sweeps of the deck. On one sweep, it pushed the rude man overboard, and then continued to swing back and forth. It looked like it wouldn't stop until the boom had snapped. Nobody was doing anything on deck because they were frozen with fear. Also, nobody had any idea what to do to stop it. But Queequeg had an idea. First he dropped to the ground and crawled under the swinging path of the boom. He did this until he was able to reach a rope, which he then tied one end of it to the sides of the upper deck. The other end he flung out like a rope with a circle at the end, and caught the boom as it went over his head. The swinging boom was quickly stopped. Next, he quickly took off his shirt and perfectly dove into the freezing dark water. I wasn't able to see anything except Queequeg swimming around. Suddenly, he disappeared underwater. When he came back up to the surface, he was holding a bent form and swimming back to the boat. Queequeg had saved the rude man, and the captain apologized to Queequeg. After seeing Queequeg's skill and bravery, I made up my mind never to leave my best friend's side. When our boat, the Moss, arrived back in Nantucket, I had to leave Queequeg for a short while. Queequeg told me that the little statue he carried about, Yojo was its name, had given him a message that I had to follow. It had said that I would have to go alone to find a whaling ship for us to sign up with. I decided to first look at the ships that were planning a 3-year whaling trip. I chose the Pequod, a small vessel that looked like it had been to sea many times. I was introduced to Captain Peleg, one of the 2 owners of the Pequod. He was sun-tanned and wrinkled from many years at sea. "Why do you want to go whaling?" asked Captain Peleg. "You're nothing but a school-teacher." "I want to know before I say you can come aboard this ship." "Well, sir, I want to experience whaling," I explained. "Have you ever heard of Captain Ahab?" "Who's Captain Ahab, sir?" "He's the captain of this ship. You should take a good look at him. Maybe it'll change your mind about tying yourself up in whaling. You'll know you found him when you see a man with only one leg." "I suppose he lost the other leg in a whaling accident?" I asked. "A whaling accident?" "Young man, no. It was bitten off by the biggest sea monster that was ever seen in the open sea." Though I wasn't pleased with the idea of meeting sea monsters aboard a whaling ship, the old captain's story didn't make me change my mind. I told the captain that I expected to meet all kinds of danger and difficulties while whaling. I finally convinced him I was going to sign aboard the Pequod. I also told him about Queequeg. Captain Peleg told me to bring him along. "The more help the better," he replied. Just when I was about to leave, I realized that I hadn't met the ship's captain, Captain Ahab. "Where can I find Captain Ahab?" I asked. "Why do you want to meet him? Do you have business with him? Just be thankful that you're being taken aboard." "Yes, but I still would like to meet him." "Well, it's not easy to meet him," said Captain Peleg. "You see, he's sick. No, he isn't exactly sick, but he's not in good health either. Anyhow, he doesn't even see me all the time, so I don't think, you being a stranger, he'll agree to see you either. He's kind of bad-tempered at times. Still, he's a good man." "A good man." "He was named after a king in the Bible." "I know the story about Ahab. Wasn't the Ahab in the Bible a wicked king who was killed?" I asked. Don't you ever say something like that on board the Pequod. I've known Captain Ahab for years, and a better captain at sea there isn't. On his last trip home he did go a little crazy, but that was because of the pain in his leg. Remember, it had been bitten off by that whale, and the pain was enough to make any man go out of his mind. Also, Ahab's got a beautiful young wife and son. He's worried about their future, too. Don't judge him just because he has a wicked name from the Bible. I took my leave from him. I was puzzled about all that Captain Peleg had said. Why did he go through so much trouble to explain the behavior of Captain Ahab? Why did he keep telling me that Captain Ahab was not to blame for his wicked name? Chapter 4. Getting Ready to Set Sail. When we went on board the Pequod, Captain Peleg stopped us. "You didn't tell me Queequeg was a human-eater," he said in a shocked voice. "It's our ship's rules that people who weren't born Christian aren't allowed aboard unless they've changed their religious beliefs to accept Christianity. Has Queequeg accepted Christianity? Do you have his papers to show he is now a Christian?" "He became a member of the First Congregational Church," I said. "Isn't that the church headed by Deacon Coleman? I walk past it every Sunday, and I've never once seen Queequeg among the members. You aren't lying to me, are you?" "Listen," I replied. "He was born a member of that church and is even a deacon himself." "Please now," said the captain, "what church are you talking about?" I said, "The First Congregational Church of the world." I was amazed at my own bravery. "This is the church where you and I and all mothers' sons pray in. Everyone belongs to that church. Though we have some small differences in belief, we share the one grand belief in God, and it's because of this that we all join hands in this church." "I must say that I've never heard a better lesson on religion," said Peleg. "Perhaps the position of ship priest would suit you better. But tell me, has your friend Queequeg ever harpooned a whale?" Queequeg himself had heard the question and decided to take the test right then and there. He jumped onto the bulwarks and then onto the bow of one of the hanging fishing boats. Holding his harpoon high above his head, he called out, "Hey, Captain! Can you see that small drop of oil under water there? Well, let's say that it's a whale's eye. Well, look then." Using his sharp aim, Queequeg threw the harpoon into the water and struck the shiny oil spot out of sight. "Now," said Queequeg, as he pulled in the line of his harpoon, "if that was a whale's eye, then that whale is now dead." This convinced Peleg to sign him aboard. When Queequeg had to sign his name on paper, he copied a tattoo that was on his left arm. After signing aboard the Pequod, we decided to walk around Nantucket for a while. We were slowly walking along the street when we were stopped by a stranger. He looked like a beggar. He was dressed in rags and had strange spots and marks all over his face. "Good fellows, have you just signed aboard that ship?" he asked, pointing his finger at the Pequod like it was a harpoon. "Yes," I answered. "We just signed the papers this morning." "Was there anything in your contract telling you about your souls?" "About our what?" I asked. I was quite shocked by this question. "Well, maybe your souls are too weak to care about it," said the stranger. "But he's got enough planned to take care of your souls, he does. Old Thunder." "Who's Old Thunder?" I asked. "Captain Ahab, of course. Haven't you heard about him?" The poorly dressed stranger seemed to have lost a bit of his mind. Still, I decided to answer in a very normal way. He knows the whaling business, and I've heard he's a good captain. Those are both true. But what about that other business with the whale? Oh, well, never mind. You've already signed your names on the papers already. I guess somebody or other has to go with him. God have pity on you. Good morning, and may the heavens look after you. You can't trick us into believing there's something wrong, I said. It's easy to look like you have a secret and know something we don't. Come on, Queequeg. Let's leave this crazy man. Well, then, I say good morning to you, he said as he turned to go. Tell us your name, will you, stranger? Elijah, he answered. Queequeg and I quickly walked away. We both agreed that the ragged old sailor was a fake who was trying to get us to sign aboard another ship. But that name Elijah made me stop and think. The Elijah in the Bible had been a special holy man who had warned of bad things to come. We had to wait a few days before leaving dock. The Pequod had first to be loaded with all the needed supplies for a 3-year voyage. During this time, I kept asking for Captain Ahab. However, I always got the same answer. I was told that Captain Ahab was getting better and would be coming on board soon. I was a little puzzled because nobody would tell me what was wrong with him. Finally, Queequeg and I received word that we'd soon be setting sail. That is, leaving soon. I still hadn't met Captain Ahab. I started to feel uncomfortable about spending 3 years on a ship, serving a captain I'd never seen. Queequeg and I had to arrive at the harbor a little before 6 o'clock in the morning. I thought I saw a couple of sailors running in front of us, but it was hard to see clearly in the morning mist. Suddenly we heard, "Stop!" We both felt a hand on our shoulders. It was Elijah. "Are you still planning on going aboard?" he asked. "We are, but that's no business of yours," I answered. "Did you take a look at some of those men going towards the ship just now?" he asked. "Yes, but it was too dark and I couldn't see anyone clearly," I said. Very dark, very dark. Well, see if you are able to find them when you get aboard. Good morning to you. I know I won't be seeing you again." With those final words, he left. I had an uneasy feeling about how he seemed so sure he wouldn't be seeing us again. Under the command of Captain Peleg, the Pequod pulled up her anchor and set sail. When we were out of sight of the bay and already on the ocean, a small sailboat pulled up next to us. It took Captain Peleg back to shore. Queequeg and I still hadn't seen Captain Ahab, but we were able to meet the other members of the crew. The chief mate was named Starbuck. He was a thin man who seemed to me brave in a very practical way. He had lost both his father and his brother at sea, so he was not the kind of man to take foolish and unnecessary risks. The second mate was named Stubb. He was an easygoing, fearless man who had a habit of smoking continuously. I imagined I would sooner see his face without his nose than to see his mouth without its little black pipe. Flask was the third mate. He was a short, round, carefree sailor who seemed to think that hunting whales was just a lot of fun. This long voyage we were making around Cape Horn, which is at the southern tip of South America, seemed to be some kind of big joke or party to him. Each of these 3 fellows was in charge of commanding one of the Pequod's small whaling boats, and each had to choose his own harpooner. Chief Mate Starbuck decided upon Queequeg. Stubb decided on Tashtigo, a Massachusetts Indian, and Dagu, a gigantic African, became Flask's harpooner. The three mates were taking turn at command of the Pequod. I had still seen nothing of Captain Ahab. A few days had passed since we'd left Nantucket. One day, finally, I came on deck for the afternoon watch. With a sudden shiver running up my back, I saw him. He was standing on deck so fiercely and seriously that I was reminded of a bronze statue that was tall and wide of form. There was a thin white scar that went from where his gray hair began right down his face and neck until it could no longer be seen inside his clothing. That scar reminded me of a line one can see in a great tree that has been struck and marked by lightning. One of Captain Ahab's legs was made of ivory, the ivory of the smooth bone of a whale's jaw. Even though the ship was rocking, Captain Ahab was able to stand firmly on that ivory leg. I wondered how he was able to do so without falling over. Then I saw that a half-inch hole had been cut on each side of the officer's quarterdeck, which is where the officers walk on deck. His ivory leg fit perfectly into that hole. It kept him erect as he stared silently out at the ever-rocking ocean. Captain Ahab seemed to have a mighty problem on his mind. Chapter 5. A Death Wish for Moby Dick. Our ship was moving southward, and we started to come upon warmer weather. Now Captain Ahab came on deck more often. He would either stand with his leg resting in the hole, or sit on a stool that was fixed the same way to the deck. Sometimes he'd walk the deck, leaning to one side from lack of balance. At night, the restless pounding of his leg upon the wooden deck would keep us all awake. One day Stubb half-jokingly asked Captain Ahab if he would cover the ivory leg with cloth the next night that he felt like walking on deck. Ahab quickly turned to him. "Go below deck, you dog!" he shouted. Stubb was too shocked to say anything for a moment. "I'm not used to being spoken to in that manner, sir. I do not like it, sir," he said. "Then I'll 10 times call you a donkey. Begone, you fool, or I'll clear the world of you." Ahab walked toward him like he was going to throw him below deck himself. Stubb quickly walked away. He said to us as he walked by, "I don't know whether to hit him or pray for him. Is he mad? Why is it he stays in bed only 3 hours at night? Even then his servant says that he doesn't sleep. The servant also says the captain's pillow is as hot as a brick that's been in an oven, like he's a fever. Something must be on his mind to trouble him so. Our captain's full of mysteries, he is." One morning after breakfast, we all heard Ahab's steady step as usual. However, when we came on deck, it looked like the marks made by his ivory leg were deeper than usual, as if his nervous steps that morning were being pushed down by his worries even more. His forehead, too, was lined, as if that one constant thought had formed upon his forehead. All day long he continued to walk the deck. Then, near the end of the day, when the sun was setting, he stopped by the bulwarks and asked for Starbuck. He commanded him to gather everyone at the back of the ship. The mate was surprised at this strange order. Ahab continued walking when we arrived. He didn't pay any attention to our curious whisperings. Finally, not turning around to see us, he cried out, "What do you do when you see a whale, men?" "Cry out for him," came the answer. "Good," he replied, turning around to us. "And what do you do next, men?" Lower the whaling boats and chase after him. And what song do you sing as you row after him, men? A dead whale or a stove-boat?" Ahab's face became happier, and he looked at us with more approval with every answer. Then he took out a round, bright coin and told us to bring him a hammer. "Look here. This coin is a Spanish ounce of gold. Whoever is the first to sight a white-headed whale that has a wrinkled brow and a crooked jaw, whoever first sights such a white-headed whale that has 3 holes in his side, whoever of you sees this white whale, then he shall have this gold ounce." "Hurrah! Hurrah!" the crew shouted as Ahab nailed the gold coin to the ship's mast. "It's a white whale," continued Ahab. "Look out, especially for whitewater. If you see even a bubble of whitewater, cry out." During Ahab's speech, Tashtego, Dagu, and Queequeg had been looking on with greater interest and more surprise than the rest of us. When they heard Ahab mention the wrinkled brow and crooked jaw of a white whale, they jumped together as if in shock. They looked as if they were trying to remember a past event. "Captain Ahab," said Tashtego softly, "are you speaking of the white whale called Moby Dick?" "Yes. Have you seen this whale, Tash?" "Does he move his tail from side to side before he goes under the water?" asked Tashtego. "And does he spout water very high, and is he very fast, Captain Ahab?" asked Dagu. "He has 2, maybe 3, iron harpoons in his side, too, Captain," cried Queequeg. "All twisted like this." Queequeg circled his hand round and round his side. "Like so." "Yes, shaped just like a spiral," cried Ahab. "Yes, Queequeg, the harpoons are all twisted in his side." "Yes, Dagu, his spout of water is mighty high." "Yes, Tashtego, he moves his tail from side to side. He does this before going under the water. Death and devils! Men, it is Moby Dick you have seen. Moby Dick, Moby Dick." "Captain Ahab," said Starbuck, "was it Moby Dick that bit off your leg?" "Yes, curse that white whale. He gave me this dead stump that I must stand on. I've promised I'll chase him round the Cape of Good Hope, and round Cape Horn, and round the flames of hell before I give up. And this is why I've signed you men aboard my ship, to chase that white whale over all sides of the earth, until he coughs black blood and rolls over. What do you say about this, men? Are you all brave enough to join hands with me on this journey now?" "Yes, yes," shouted the harpooners and seamen in agreement. "God bless you, men," Ahab half cried, half shouted. "Servant, go below and bring some wine for these men." Then Ahab saw that Starbuck was standing silently to the side. He went up to him and asked, "Starbuck, tell me why you look so down. Won't you join us in hunting Moby Dick?" "I can hunt after Moby Dick and his crooked jaw, even hunt the jaws of death too, if it is part of the whaling business we follow. But I came aboard this ship to hunt whales, not to help my captain take revenge." Starbuck seemed to be alone in not agreeing with the captain, but as first mate he would not fight against his captain's orders. "God save me! God save us all!" he whispered softly. When the servant returned with the wine, Ahab ordered a big silver drinking cup to be filled with wine. "Drink, and pass it along to each man," he cried. Then he handed it to the nearest seaman. "Take big drinks, men. It's as hot as the devil's feet. Well done. The cup's almost finished. Servant, refill the cup. Next, he called for the 3 mates to gather around him. Put your lances together in a cross, so that I may again do a noble custom of my fishermen fathers, he said. Holding the 3 irons at their crossed center, he looked deeply from Starbuck to Stubb and from Stubb to Flask. It seemed that he was trying to fire their hearts with his own fiery hatred. The mates all had to look away from his strong, magical eyes. Put down your lances. Then Ahab turned to Queequeg, Tashtego, and Dagu. And now, my 3 brave harpooners, take away the poles from your weapons, men. Queequeg, Tashtego, and Dagu took off the iron tips of their harpoons and turned them upside down. There was an empty space on the bottom of each iron tip. Ahab filled these like they were wine cups. Then he ordered, Drink, you harpooners! Drink and promise on your soul! Death to Moby Dick! God hunt us all if we do not hunt Moby Dick to his death. Chapter 6. The Mysterious 5. Aboard this ship I began to learn all sorts of information about whales and about Moby Dick in particular. The most valued of all whales is the sperm whale, because of its spermaceti, a white wax-like liquid removed from the oil that is inside the sperm whale's head. Spermaceti is used to light all the lamps of the world. Also, it is the main oil used in making expensive perfume. Moby Dick was a sperm whale, but he was different than others. I learned it was possible to see him from a great distance because he was different. He not only had a strange snow-white lined forehead and a huge high white hump, but also a huge body lined and spotted with the same color of white. Other sailors who had seen him had given him the nickname of the White Whale. Moby Dick was also different in behavior from other whales. He seemed to be more clever than the rest. He was known to swim quickly away from a boat lowered to chase him. But he was only pretending to be scared. All of a sudden, he would turn around and swim toward those chasing him. He would either break their boat into bits of wood or drive them back to their ship in terror. There was a story that once before Ahab had gone after Moby Dick with 3 boats. All 3 were smashed to pieces by the whale. When Ahab saw his men drowning in the waves of the sea, he grabbed a small knife and ran toward Moby Dick's heart like some wild man in a fight. Just at that moment, Moby Dick stuck out his curved lower jaw beneath Ahab and bit off his leg. Since then, Ahab wanted revenge against the whale. To Ahab, it seemed that all the evil of the world was inside this one whale. If he could kill Moby Dick, then he could save the world from evil. I was quite amazed at how he made the crew believe this too. They also shared his hatred and believed his enemy to also be their own. One moonlit night, we had all lined up waiting for the scuttlebutt to fill. A scuttlebutt is a barrel for holding the daily fresh water supply. Suddenly I heard one of the seamen whisper to another, "Did you hear that noise?" "What noise?" "Shh! There it is again, under the deck. It sounds like someone coughing." "Oh, be silent, will you? It's only the noise of your stomach after you ate 3 soaked cakes for supper, nothing else. Now give me the bucket." "You can joke if it makes you feel better," said the seaman. "But we'll see what turns up sooner or later. I think there's a person below deck whom none of us have seen yet. And I'm pretty sure old Ahab knows about this too.
I heard Stubb tell Flask one morning that he felt there was something strange happening on this boat."
The other sailor didn't say anything to this. Then Tush-to-go, who was keeping watch, suddenly cried out,
"There she blows!"
I looked over to where the Indian had seen a whale. Tush-to-go stood high in the air, his arms stretched out in front of him like a branch.
"There she blows! There! There! There!"
"Where? Where?" everyone shouted excitedly.
"On the lee beam side of the ship, about 2 miles away. There's a whole group of them."
The lee beam side meant the whales were on the side of the ship away from the wind. Instantly, everybody started moving about and everything became noisy.
"Quick, servant," cried Ahab. "Tell me what time it is, the time."
Doughboy, the servant, hurried below, looked at the clock, and reported the exact minute to Ahab. Ahab kept very careful notes of the location and time of whales that had been sighted or captured. He used this to try to understand more about whales and how they lived. He kept a large roll of sea maps, and he would spend hours studying the many lines and drawings. He would draw the way that whales traveled with his pencil. He also studied the currents of all 4 oceans. All this he did for one reason, to find and kill Moby Dick. But now we were going after other whales. This was, after all, the main business of the Pequod. Still, I knew that Ahab could not forget his real goal. The ship was moved out of the wind. 3 boats were lowered down to the sea. At this exciting instant, we suddenly heard a loud cry. Everyone looked away from the whales to look at Ahab. The captain wasn't alone on deck. He stood surrounded by 5 yellow men who seemed to have come out of thin air. These strangers were now lowering one of the spare boats into the ocean.
"Are you ready, Fedallah?"
cried Ahab.
"Ready,"
said a tall, dark figure. He had one evil-looking tooth sticking out from his iron-like lips. His long white hair was twisted and wrapped around his head like an Indian hat. The other men looked like they were a group of natives from the Philippine Islands, which is near Australia. Sailors who believed in unscientific or old religious thoughts believed people from this area were working with the devil.
"Lower the boats down, then,"
shouted Captain Ahab. With that order, we leaped down into the 3 tossed boats below. In the 4th boat, rowed by the 5 strangers, stood Ahab. Ahab was shouting across the water at Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask to move far so as to cover a larger area. When Stubb's boat came near to Starbuck's, he yelled out,
"What do you think of those 5 yellow men, sir?"
"I'm sure Ahab brought them aboard in secret before the ship sailed," called Starbuck.
"Row strongly, strong there, boys."
"I think it's a sad business, Mr. Stubb, that Ahab has to keep secrets from his crew. But never mind. Nothing's to be done now."
"That's why he kept going down below deck so often. The men were hiding down there. This has something to do with the white whale. Well, well, can't be helped now. Give way, men. We're not hunting the white whale today."
I silently remembered the mysterious shadows I had seen moving about the Pequod during the dim light of morning when we were still in Nantucket. I remembered, too, the strange words of that man Elijah. I would have a lot to think about once this was all over. But for now, all I wanted to do was get close to those whales. Chapter 7. Men Overboard. Ahab's tiger yellow men seemed to be made of steel and whalebone.
Like 5 strong hammers, they rowed with hard, regular pulls on their oars. Fedallah, at one end of the boat, pulled the harpooner's oar, while at the other end Ahab steadily managed the steering oar to direct the boat. "Flask," called Ahab across to the other boat. "Move your boat more to the leeward side, man." "Yes, sir." Flask moved his large oar round. "Row hard, men," he shouted. "I can see the whales right ahead, boys. Roar and row as strong as thunder." Meanwhile, Stubb was helping his men to row in a very different and rather funny way. He'd start with the most funny jokes and even tell stories to them. His tone was half angry and half joking. "Row, row, my little ones," shouted Stubb. "Why aren't your backs broken, boys? Don't worry about those 5 in that boat over there with Ahab. Hurrah for the golden cup of sperm oil! The devil comes and takes you lazy bones away. You're all asleep. Wake up and row. Take out your knife and start rowing with the blade between your teeth. That's more like it now." Starbuck, in another boat, had a different way. He whispered commands in a low, strong voice. "Pull! Pull! My good boys!" He wasn't one to say much to his crew, and they didn't say anything at all to him. The sight was all wonder and awe. The roaring waves of the sea, the boats moving to the top of a watery hill, then sliding down its other side, the winds tossing them about. The cries of the harpooners was mixed with the loud, quick breathing of the rowers. Behind the boats came the Pequod with her full sails, following like a mother chicken chasing after her screaming babies. It was exciting. Starbuck now started to chase 3 whales as our boat rushed along in the rising wind and mist. Suddenly, as quick as lightning, he whispered to Queequeg, "Stand up." Queequeg jumped to his feet and waited for Starbuck's command. Then we heard, "That's his hump. There, give it to him." Queequeg's harpoon made a rushing sound, and then there was confusion. It seemed like an invisible push coming from the back of our boat. Then something rolled like an earthquake beneath us, tossing all of us helplessly into the sea. The wind, our boat, and the harpoon seemed to all mix together, and the whale, only touched by the iron, escaped. After some swimming, we were able to pick up our floating oars and climb back into the lonely boat. Because of the storm, we couldn't see the Pequod. The mist was getting deeper, and it was no use to cry for help. Soon the dawn came on, and we sat in our boat soaked with water, shaking from the cold and without hope. It was Queequeg who first heard a noise. He jumped to his feet, putting his hand to his ear. In the silence we heard a very soft creaking sound. Then, before any of us knew what was happening, the Pequod appeared, heading toward us. We all jumped into the sea just seconds before our boat was crushed by the Pequod. Again, we had to swim for our lives in the tossing sea. Finally, the crew saw us and we were safely taken up on board. On deck, we learned that the 3 other boats had gotten back all right. "Queequeg," I said, still shaking from the cold, "my dear friend, does this happen often?" He calmly told me that yes, it did. Stubb and Flask also agreed. Because these 3 men thought it rather normal to be overturned in a small boat, and because that they saw nothing strange in Starbuck going after a whale in the middle of a huge storm, and also because of Ahab's mad desire to hunt for the white whale, I decided to be sensible. "Queequeg," I said, "I am going below deck to make a rough copy of my will. Come along, you shall be my lawyer and adviser." Chapter 8.
A victim of Moby Dick. The Cape of Good Hope is a strange name for a part of the ocean of horrible and deadly seas, howling winds, and jumping waves. We met another ship a little to the southwest of this point. It was the Albatross. Judging from her old sides and the poor appearance of her ragged sailors, she was a ship that hadn't been home for a long time. "Ship ahoy!" Ahab called to the other captain. "Have you seen the white whale?" The captain of the Albatross put the horn to his mouth, but it fell out of his hand into the sea, and he wasn't able to make himself heard. So we continued past them. After a while we met another whaling ship that was going home, the Town Ho. This time Ahab allowed a gam, or exchange of visits. On the Town Ho were some crewmen who whispered the secret of their ship to Tashtigo. Later, he told us about it, and it made us more curious and interested in Moby Dick. What happened aboard the Town Ho was this. A sailor and the first mate had gotten into a fight over an order about who was to sweep the deck. In self-defense, the sailor hit the mate so hard that he passed out. Other crew members then became involved, and soon the fight was in danger of destroying the order on the ship. Steelkilt, the seaman, was about to kill Radney, the chief mate, when a call was heard. Moby Dick had been sighted. Radney's boat was the first boat lowered into the sea, and as he stood with his harpoon, he was washed overboard. Moby Dick came underneath him and closed his jaws on Radney. Then the white whale pulled himself up as if on show before diving down deep into the freezing water. When the whale came back to the surface, he had some pieces of Radney's red wool shirt caught in his teeth. The other 4 boats chased after him, but Moby Dick disappeared. After hearing this story, we couldn't stop thinking about Moby Dick. Dagu, who had the lookout, saw a great white mass that kept rising and sinking in the ocean. "There she spouts water, right ahead," he called. "The white whale! The white whale!" Ahab gave instant commands to lower the boats. He moved his boat ahead of the other 3. I watched as a vast, big, cream-colored whale came floating on the water. Countless numbers of long arms came out from its center. They looked like a nest of white snakes. It didn't have a face or even a front. It was just a shapeless thing like a ghost. When it disappeared again, it made a low sound like water being drawn downward. Starbuck said, "I would have rather seen and fought Moby Dick than that white ghost." "What in the world was that, sir?" asked Flask. "The great live squid. Among whalers there is a belief that ships who see the squid never return to their homes. Ahab didn't say anything. He turned his boat back to the ship, and the rest of us silently followed. However, Queequeg had a different belief about the squid. "When you see a squid, then you will surely see a sperm whale." The next day was so hot that all of us were lazy and only wanted to sleep. But sure enough, just as Queequeg had said earlier, we spotted a huge sperm whale swimming along and spouting its jet of water. He reminded me of a fat man lazily smoking his pipe on a warm afternoon. As if struck by magic, we no longer were sleepy men, but whalers busy lowering the boats into the water. We must have made some noise that frightened the whale, for he threw his tail 40 feet into the air and dove out of sight, like a tower disappearing under a wave. Stubb was the nearest to the whale, and he counted on having the honor of capturing it. "Start her! Start her, rowing like thunder, my men," he ordered. "But keep cool.
Calm and cool is the word. Start her, Tash, my boy. Wahoo! Wahee! Screamed the Indian in reply, as if raising an old Indian war cry. The other boats answered his wild screams with their own. Ki-hee! Ki-hee! Yelled Daggoo. He looked like a restless tiger walking back and forth in a cage. Kala! Kulu! Cried Queequeg. The men in Stubb's boat rowed hard until the command was heard. Stand up, Tashtego! Give it to him! The harpoon was thrown and sank into the whale. Attached, the boat now flew through the rolling water like a shark that is all muscle. She seemed to go on for miles and miles this way, until at last the whale grew tired and had to slow his escape. Bring him in! Bring him in! Cried Stubb. The men began pulling the boat up to the whale using the harpoon's rope. Stubb sent harpoon after harpoon into the whale's body. Soon the ocean was red on all sides of the whale. The sun's reflection on the bloody water could be seen on the faces of the men, so that they all glowed like red men. Pull up! Stubb now cried, and the boat reached the whale's side. Reaching over the front of the boat, Stubb stuck his long lance into the heart of the whale and twisted and turned it. The whale made a last attempt to escape. The boat had to go back to miss his mad, boiling spray. Then the spray stopped, and we could hear the opening and closing of his spout hole, like a dying breath. He was breathing with sharp, crackling breaths. Streams of red blood shot into the air, then ran down the whale's sides into the sea. His heart had burst. Stubb removed his pipe from his mouth and threw the ashes all over the water, as if performing some act of respect for the dead whale. He thoughtfully looked at the vast, newly dead body he had just killed. Chapter 9. Another Speaker of Evil. 3 boats were now lowered to pull the prize back to the Pequod. By the time our 36 arms and 180 fingers had moved this vast body, it was already dark. The sight of the dead whale seemed to hurt Ahab. It seemed to remind him that Moby Dick was out there, still alive, still waiting to be killed. But Stubb was in a good mood from all the excitement. He ordered whale steak for his dinner. Early the next morning we began the long, hard job of cutting up the dead whale. A foot-thick blanket of fat covers a whale like a skin covers an orange. First, Starbuck and Stubb used long knives to dig a hole in the fat. Next, a huge hook was put in the fat, and it took a whole crew of men to pull away just the first strip. Then some men took the strip of fat and began to wind it around and around. This was repeated over and over again until all the fat was taken care of in this way. A single whale has enough fat to make 100 barrels of oil. It is almost a lake of liquid weighing about 10 tons. Our work was interrupted by the cry, "Ship ahead!" It was another whaler out of Nantucket, the Jeroboam. She lowered one of her boats, and Starbuck ordered a ladder let down from our ship for the visiting captain. But instead of coming aboard, the Jeroboam's commander, Captain Mayhew, waved his hand to show they would be staying in their little boat. Captain Mayhew cried out to us that they wouldn't come on board because of a bad illness that had spread to all the crew aboard the Jeroboam. Stubb thought he recognized one of the oarsmen in the boat. He was a small, wild-eyed young man with spots on his face. "That must be Gabriel," said Stubb. There were stories from other crews about a strange man named Gabriel who had been as a Shaker. The Shakers were an American religious group who shook their bodies during their worship. They were Christians, but they lived among themselves and were skilled in furniture making. After joining this crew, Gabriel had announced himself to be a prophet, that is, a person who can speak directly to God. Saying he was the angel Gabriel, he had demanded command of the ship. The captain ordered him to stop his behavior or he would be dropped back on land. Then Gabriel began to open all sorts of mysterious little bottles. He told the captain that terrible things would happen to them if the captain didn't let him stay aboard. The crewmen strongly believed in Gabriel's power, so they told the captain that not one of them would stay if Gabriel wasn't obeyed. They wouldn't let him be punished in any way either. Thus Gabriel had complete freedom on the ship. When the illness happened, Gabriel had even more power. He told the crew that the disease was there because he had ordered it to happen, and that only he had full power to stop it. The sailors believed everything he said. The Jeroboam had also seen the white whale. The chief mate, Harry Macy, was very eager to go after him when he was spotted. But Gabriel, in his wild manner that sounded like nonsense, warned him not to. He said that Moby Dick was really his shaker god in a whale's body. But Macy didn't listen and finally got 5 men to go with him in his boat. Gabriel continued to speak of evil future events from aboard the ship while one of the men in the boat stuck an iron into Moby Dick. Suddenly, a broad white shadow rose from the water, and the whale, by the quick and strong movement of its tail, blew the breath out of the oarsmen's bodies. The next moment, Macy was thrown into the air and fell into the sea 50 yards away. Not a single bit of the boat was harmed, nor one hair on any oarsman's head. But the mate sank into the sea forever and was never found. At this point, Captain Mayhew asked Ahab if he would hunt Moby Dick if he had the chance. "Yes," answered Ahab. Gabriel heard Ahab's answer and quickly jumped to his feet. He looked angrily at the man. Gabriel shouted, "Beware! Think of Macy! He didn't respect God, and now he's dead, down there in the sea. Beware of the same end." Ahab turned away. He was troubled by Gabriel. Starbuck remembered that the Nantucket had a letter to deliver to one of the Jeroboam's officers, in case the 2 ships were to meet. He went to look for it and soon returned, holding a wet, worn piece of mail. It was covered with green spots from being kept in a dark and wet cupboard for too long. Ahab took the envelope and tried to figure out the writing on the envelope. Yes, a woman's handwriting. The man's wife, I'll bet. Mr. Harry Macy. Ship Jeroboam. Why, it's for Macy, but he's dead." "Keep it," cried Gabriel to Ahab. "That's the way you're soon going, soon enough." "Enough of you," yelled Ahab. "Captain Mayhew, I'll hand you the letter." But Gabriel snatched the letter from Captain Mayhew's hand and threw it back to the Pequod. It fell right at Ahab's feet. Chapter 10. A right whale on board. One day we spotted a group of right whales. The oil of these whales was not as high quality as that of the sperm whales, so I thought we would not hunt them. But the cry came to lower the boats into the sea. Stubb and Flask climbed into the boats to chase after the group of tall spouts. They managed to harpoon one whale, and the 2 boats pulled up close to the body. Then they each took turns cutting the whale with their lances. Finally, the whale was dead and ready to be brought back to the boat. "What do you think the captain wants with this?" asked Stubb as they rowed back to the ship. "Didn't you ever hear about the old whaling belief?" asked Flask. "If a ship has a sperm whale's head above her starboard, or right side, Then she needs a right whale on her larboard or left side. After this, she can never afterwards be overturned in the ocean. I've never heard anything like that. Where did you hear it? Asked Stubb. From Fedallah, replied Flask. I think Fedallah will make this ship meet a bad end. What do you think, Stubb? Well, I think he might be the devil in disguise. We don't see his devil tail because he keeps it hidden in his pocket. Yes, I heard he sleeps in his boots, added Stubb. That way no one can see his goat-like feet. That'll show he's the devil. I even bet he's made a deal with Ahab.
Probably Ahab got him to
trade away his soul in exchange for Moby Dick. You're joking, Stubb. How's that possible? I don't know, Flask, but look ahead. We're here. Keep rowing ahead and let's get this whale beside the ship. The two boats pulling the whale very slowly arrived back at the Pequod. Do you really mean what you've been saying all along? Flask asked. Mean or not mean? We're here at the ship, replied Stubb. On the side of the ship, away from the sperm whale, were chains. They were getting ready to bring up the right whale. Didn't I say so? Said Flask, pointing up at the sperm whale's head, raised above the Pequod's starboard side. I knew that Fedallah would do this. Soon you'll see this head hung up across from the other ones. Later, what Flask said became true. One day, I saw Fedallah studying the head of the right whale. He was comparing the lines on the whale's forehead with the lines on the palm of his own hand. It looked like he was reading a secret message about the future. Chapter 11. Queequeg saves the day again. Even though the sperm whale's head had been hanging for a long time, there was still very important work to be done, the work of removing a treasure. That treasure is in an enormous sack within the forehead of the whale. It contains precious oil. It is very important not to make a hole in this sack, or some of the 500 gallons of oil would be lost. Tashtigo decided to do this job of removing the sack. He climbed a pole so that he was hanging over the swinging whale's head. Then he let himself down with a rope, hand over hand, until he landed on top of the whale's head. But he did not begin to cut at once. Instead, he carefully tapped the skin with the bottom of the knife so that he could tell where the walls of the sack were. By the time he found the sack, an iron bucket had been attached to one end of the rope and lowered down to him. The other end was held by two men standing across the deck. Tashtigo cut a hole in the forehead and pushed the bucket into the whale's sack until it disappeared. Then he told the two men to pull on the rope, and up came a bucket filled with oil. Then it was emptied into a large tub and returned to Tashtigo. He had to do this about 100 times. Finally, the bucket was about 20 feet down inside the whale's forehead. Suddenly, Tashtigo slipped and fell headfirst into the sack. With a horrible watery sound, he disappeared. "Man in danger!" cried Dagu. He put a foot into the bucket and called to be raised above the top of the whale's head. Then a loud cracking noise made everyone stop and look in horror. The head had torn loose from one of its hooks. It started to swing left and right, and it looked at any moment ready to fall. With a thunder boom, the enormous head fell into the sea. Dagu was still hanging on the rope, but Tashtigo was still inside the head, and now was sinking to the bottom of the sea. Then Queequeg stripped off his clothes, and with a sword in hand, jumped into the sea to the rescue. In a few moments,
we saw an arm rising strangely out of the sea.
It seemed like an arm reaching out from the grass that covers over a grave. "Both! Both! It's both of them!" cried Daggoo. Soon we could see Queequeg swimming with one hand. He was holding the long hair of Tashtego with the other. When Queequeg described the rescue later, it seemed to us an amazing one. He had swum down after the sinking whalehead. When he found it, he cut some holes near the bottom with his sword. Then he stuck his arm into the head and grabbed Tashtego's leg. But this wasn't good because he couldn't pull him out by his leg, so he gave the leg a heavy push. This made the Indian's body turn over. He managed to find Tashtego's head and was able to swim, pulling him along with him in tow.
Chapter 12. On the Trail of the White Whale. "Ship ahoy! Have you seen the white whale?" Ahab gave this call to a passing ship that was flying an English flag. The captain of the Samuel Enderby was a strong, sunburned, fine-looking gentleman, about 60 years old. The right sleeve of his jacket was flying in the wind. "Have you seen the white whale?" Ahab repeated. "Do you see this?" answered the captain. He held up the right sleeve of his jacket, and Ahab gasped. The captain's arm was made of sperm whale bone. Instead of a hand, there was a wooden head like a hammer. Ahab's boat was quickly lowered for a visit to the ship. When Ahab climbed aboard, the Enderby's captain walked forward and held out his ivory arm. Then Ahab pulled up his trouser leg and crossed it with his ivory leg, saying, "Aye, aye, let us shake our bones together, an arm and a leg. I bet it was the white whale who took your arm off." "Aye," said the captain. "We had spotted some 4 or 5 whales, and had lowered our boats to hunt them. Just when we managed to harpoon one and get our boat fastened, a bouncing great whale with a milky white head and hump came up from under the sea." "It was him! It was Moby Dick!" shouted Ahab. "There were harpoons sticking into his right side," added the captain. "Those were mine! Those were my irons!" cried Ahab. "Please, go on, go on." "That white whale started to bite at the harpoon line I had in the other whale." "Aye, he wanted to free the other whale. An old trick, I know him." "That white whale held the line in his teeth, and I saw that he was the biggest and most grand whale I had ever seen in all my life. Then I decided to capture him, even though he was going mad with anger. I jumped into another boat, grabbed the nearest harpoon, and stuck it into the old whale." Ahab could hardly control his excitement. "What happened next?" he shouted. "Next thing I knew, all I could see was black foam, and his tail came right out of the water like a marble building. Suddenly, the tail comes down and cuts my boat in 2. Then he starts to run away from our wreck." "And then?" cried Ahab. "I grabbed tightly the pole of my harpoon that was sticking in him. I just held strongly to that, but the rolling sea tore me off, and the whale went under water as quickly as lightning. The next thing I knew, the point of that cursed harpoon caught me here at my shoulder and carried me down to hell's flames, I thought." Ahab looked at the part where the captain's arm ended. It was right below the shoulder. "Thank God, the sharp iron point tore through the flesh down the whole length of my arm. It came out at my wrist, and I was free." The ship's doctor came now to finish the story. "Aye, it was a 2-foot wound. Unfortunately, it became infected, and I had to cut off the arm." "What happened to the white whale?" asked Ahab.
It was clear that this was his only interest. "We saw him again 2 more times after that," said the captain. "Didn't you go after him again?" "Heavens, no! Isn't losing one arm enough?" The English captain looked thoughtfully at Ahab's ivory leg and asked, "Do you want to go after that whale again?" he asked. "Perhaps," said Ahab strongly. "I'm going after him even if he tries to run to the end of this world. Tell me which way he was heading." "East, I think." He then turned to Fedallah and whispered, "Good God, is Captain Ahab crazy?" But Fedallah didn't answer. He put his finger on his lip, jumped over the side of the Samuel Enderby, and took our boat's oar. Ahab followed him and was soon standing in the small boat, with his men ready to start rowing. As if trying to warn him, the other captain tried to call out to Ahab, but to no use. Ahab was standing with his back to the Enderby like a statue. He didn't move until our small boat was next to the Pequod. Chapter 13. Return to Life. Our many barrels of whale oil were by now quite a treasure. They were stored below deck in the hold. Our men had to water them down twice a week with seawater in order to protect them. This was done for 2 reasons. First, the water made the wooden barrel's seal become tight so no oil would leak out. Second, it was possible to see from the water that was running off if there was any oil mixed with it. They were able to know if there were any holes in the barrels. The next morning after meeting the Enderby, our sailors were pumping the water off the barrels. They discovered a lot of oil rising and mixing with the water. Starbuck rushed down to Ahab's cabin to tell him about it. "One of the barrels in the hold is leaking, sir. We've got to take out the barrels and see where the leak is." Ahab was studying his charts and turned around angrily at Starbuck. "We're too close to Japan," he yelled. "There's no time to waste trying to fix a lot of old barrels." "But, sir," argued Starbuck, "if we don't fix that leak, we'll lose more oil than we can replace in 1 year. We have to save it, otherwise we'll lose everything we came for." "That's true," said Ahab, "if we get what we've come for." "I mean the oil in the hold, sir," said Starbuck calmly. "And I don't mean that," shouted Ahab. "Let that oil leak. Leave me alone now, Starbuck." "But, sir, what are the owners going to say?" "I don't care what the owners say. They can stand on Nantucket Beach and scream at the storms. The only real owner of anything is its commander, and I'm the commander of the Pequod. Now go up on deck." "But, Captain," said Starbuck. He was hoping that Ahab would change his mind. But Ahab didn't. He grabbed a loaded gun that was next to him and pointed it at Starbuck. "There is one God that is Lord over this earth, and one captain that is Lord over the Pequod. Now go." Starbuck's eyes were flashing fire, but he managed to calm himself. He said, "You have angered me, not insulted me, so there's no need for me to warn you to beware of Starbuck. You would only laugh at that. But, sir, let Ahab beware of Ahab. You are your own worst enemy." After Starbuck had left, Ahab thought about what Starbuck had said. "Let Ahab beware of Ahab," he repeated to himself thoughtfully. Finally, Ahab decided to listen to Starbuck. But it's unclear why he changed his mind. Maybe he realized the truth behind Starbuck's words, or he thought it was safer to keep good feeling between himself and his chief officer. Anyway, in the end he ordered the barrels of whale oil to be raised and looked at. This was when poor Pequod got sick. Working in the cold and wet hold made him catch a chill and a terribly high fever. He had to stay in bed, and every day he looked like he was wasting away into nothing but his bones and his tattoos. He was on death's door. One day, Queequeg asked a strange favor of me. He said he had seen in Nantucket dark wood canoes with lids, like those on his native islands. He knew that all whalemen who died in Nantucket were placed in these dark canoes or coffins. He liked this idea, and said it was like his homeland custom of laying a dead soldier in his canoe and letting him float out into sea, away into the starry island of the sky. Upon hearing this wish, the ship's carpenter went to Queequeg and measured his width and height very carefully. He used dark wood cut from some island trees stored on a previous trip, and set to work on Queequeg's coffin canoe. Queequeg asked for his harpoon, and had it placed in the coffin once it was finished. Then he asked for one of his boat paddles to be put in. He also asked for a flask of fresh water, a bag of earth, and a piece of sailcloth that was rolled up for a pillow. When everything was in place, he asked to be lifted from his bed into his final bed for a tryout. Just as if he was dead, he lay there with his arms crossed and with the little god Yojo on his breast. Then he sat up and told us to return him to his bed. But Queequeg suddenly got better, even though he had made all these preparations for his death. It was as if he'd changed his mind about dying. He started to use his coffin for a sea chest now. He emptied his bag of clothes into it. During rest time, he spent many hours carving all kinds of strange figures and drawings on the lid. Most of these were copied from the twisted tattoos on his body. One day I asked him about the tattoos. He said they had been drawn by a holy man who had figured out the mystery behind heaven and earth. Queequeg was a kind of living and walking puzzle, a mystery story. Chapter 14. Strange Signs for the Future. There was an old ironworker named Perth on board the Pequod, and Ahab went to see him one day about a special job. The captain brought with him a sack of nails from the shoes of racing horses and asked the ironworker to melt them down. This was for an especially strong harpoon iron. When it was time for Perth to give the sharp barb, or point, its final heating, he went to find a barrel of water. This was done so that the iron would be tempered or hardened. But Ahab had a different idea in mind. "No water for that," said Ahab. "I want it to be a true weapon of death. It must be done in human blood." He turned to the three persons. Tashtigo, Queequeg, Dagu, he asked, "Will you give me your blood?" The three men agreed, and their skin was cut. Soon the iron point of the white whale's harpoon was tempered in human blood. Later that night, Ahab had a nightmare. He quickly went up on deck to find Fedallah. Fedallah was on watch. Ahab told him about his dream. In the dream, he saw himself in a hearse, which is a carriage that carries the dead. Fedallah looked at him in the dim moving light of the lantern. "I have already told you about the way you will die. Don't you remember? I told you that there would not be either a hearse or a coffin." "But people who die at sea do not have hearses," said Ahab. "Aye, but I also told you that before you die, you must see two hearses on the sea," Fedallah reminded him. "The first hearse will not be made by the hands of humans, and the second hearse will be made of wood that is from America." "That would be a strange thing to see out here on the ocean," said Ahab. "But you also told me about yourself. What was it again? That I'm to die before you, so that I can guide you into the other world. But you also said that after you die, you would again appear to me, to guide me, right? I guess that your sight of the future means that I will be able to kill Moby Dick. Here is another thing for certain, Captain, said the Indian mysteriously. Only a rope can kill you. The only way to die from a rope is from hanging. But that can never be out here in the ocean, Ahab laughed jokingly. Therefore, I'm going to live forever. We were nearing the equator, the line that divides the northern and southern hemispheres of this world. It was there that Ahab hoped to see Moby Dick. We started to hear strange cries not of this earth, like the cries of ghosts. These sounds were coming from some islands which we were sailing past. The civilized or Christian part of the crew said it was mermaids or half-fish, half-human creatures, and they shook with fear. The non-Christian harpooners just remained calm, but the oldest sailor on the ship, a man from the Isle of Man off the coast of England, had a different story. According to him, what we were hearing was the cries of sailors who had just drowned at sea. Later, Flask told Ahab about the strange sounds. The old man laughed. I know all about those sounds, he said. Those are the cries of mother seals that have lost their babies, or the cries of baby seals that have lost their mothers. This explanation didn't help the crew to feel better. Most sailors have strange old beliefs about seals. This is because a seal's troubled cries sound like a human's. Also, seals have round heads, and their half-intelligent faces look somewhat like the heads and faces of humans. Thus, the cries were seen as an evil sign for the future, and the men were expecting something bad to happen soon. Sure enough, the worst did happen. One day, one of the sailors climbed the mainmast to look out for the white whale. He was very sleepy, and he fell down into the sea. We threw a wooden life-saver into the water to help him, for he couldn't swim. But water had gotten into the wood life-saver before, which had made the wood shrink. So it didn't float, and the poor sailor drowned in the sea. It seemed like the unlucky sign had come true. But the old sailor from the Isle of Man disagreed. He said that the bad thing had not happened yet, and was still to come. Because of all the dangers on the sea, we needed to find another life-saver. But we couldn't find any wood on board that was light enough in weight. Then Queequeg pointed to his coffin. He said the fine, hard wood could work if they were to nail the lid on tightly so that no water could get in. The officers thought this idea was strange at first, but finally they agreed. The Pequod's life-saver now would be a coffin. The next day, a very large ship, the Rachel, came heading toward us. Many men were sitting on her beams and poles. "Have you seen the white whale?" came Ahab's voice. "Aye, we saw him yesterday." "Now we have a question. Have you seen a single whaleboat by itself?" "We've lost one of ours," said the captain of the Rachel. Ahab didn't bother to answer the question because he was so excited to hear that Moby Dick had been seen. He made ready to go aboard the ship, but the Rachel's captain got to our ship first instead. The captain of the Rachel arrived and answered Ahab's eager questions. "We sent 4 boats after that white whale. The fastest of our boats fastened to him with a harpoon. Suddenly, both the boat and the whale disappeared. We all figured that the wounded whale was running with his hunters. However, we searched all through the night and haven't been able to find our missing boat." The captain continued, even though Ahab seemed to have lost interest. "I want to ask you to join us in our rescue search. If we start to sail in lines, then we can find my missing men and—" He stopped for a moment and then said, "You see, my own son is among them." The Rachel's captain saw the cold expression on Ahab's face. "Please, for God's own sake, man, I am begging you," he cried. "Let me use your ship. I'll gladly pay." "We have to help him find the boy," cried Stubb. There were cries of approval for Stubb's idea from the other men on board. But the old sailor from the Isle of Man raised his hand and said, "The boy drowned with the rest of the sailors in the boat last night," he said. "We heard their spirits on that island, didn't we?" The captain of the Rachel seemed to lose all hope. But Ahab ignored the poor man and coldly said, "I will not do it. You see, we are losing time right now just even talking to you. Goodbye, and God bless you, man." The captain of the Rachel couldn't believe that Ahab could be so unfeeling. Then Ahab turned to Starbuck and ordered, "Mr. Starbuck, have these strangers set off in 3 minutes, and let the ship sail as before." Chapter 15. The First Day's Chase. A few days later, we met another ship named the Delight. Ahab again asked the captain the same question. The captain of the Delight replied by showing us a whaleboat that was hanging. It was almost completely destroyed. "Did you manage to kill him?" asked Ahab. "There's nothing and no one yet that can kill him," said the captain of the Delight. "Look what I have here," yelled Ahab, and he held up his new harpoon. "God be with you," cried the captain of the Delight. "That cursed white whale has already killed 5 of my good men. This ocean is their grave." Fearing that only the worst could happen, Starbuck again begged Ahab to turn back. "We have the whale oil we need. Let our men return safely back to their wives and their children." Starbuck's words seemed to make Ahab soften. He started to speak with feeling about his own wife and son. "My boy is probably walking now, sitting up in bed, and his mother will be telling him about how I am at sea and how I will return again to play with him." Ahab stopped, and something changed on his face. He said, "There is a monster inside of me that is making me do this. No, Starbuck, I will never rest until I have killed the evil Moby Dick." The next morning Ahab smelled the sea air and said, "A whale is near." Soon everyone could smell the strange smell that a sperm whale has, and the old man quickly changed the ship's course to follow it. "I will make the first sighting myself," cried Ahab, "and I will have the gold coin for sighting the whale first, Ahab alone." He pointed to the gold coin he nailed to the mainmast so long ago. Ahab raised himself up the mainmast for a full look at the sea. He was about 2/3 of the way up when we heard him shout, "There she blows! There she blows! A hump like a snow hill! It is Moby Dick!" The men on deck were excited to have a quick look at the famous whale they had been chasing for so long. Moby Dick was about a mile or so ahead, and we could all see his tall but silent spouts. "Was I the first to see him?" cried Ahab to all the men standing around on the ropes. "I did, almost that same moment as you," said Tashtigo, "and I cried out." "Not the same instant, though," cried Ahab. "No, the coin is mine. Heaven has saved it for me alone. Only I could make Moby Dick appear." Ahab started to climb down and began shouting orders in excitement. "Stand by! Stand by! Get the boats ready! Quicker! Quicker!" And he lowered himself onto the deck. Soon all the boats but Starbuck's were lowered into the ocean. Ahab was close enough to see the lines on the white whale's head. The broken pole of a whaler's harpoon was still in Moby Dick's back. From here, the whale seemed so calm and peaceful, but this was only because his terrible jaws were hidden under the water. Suddenly, the whale lifted up his body and made a high white arch. Then he waved his tail like he was warning us. After this, he quickly sank below the surface of the ocean. The three boats waited in the stillness for the return of Moby Dick. Ahab looked hard with concentration over the side of his boat into the deep sea. He saw a white form rising quickly. Soon it turned into 2 long rows of white teeth. It was the jaws of Moby Dick opening beneath Ahab's boat. Ahab, with one huge sweep of his steering oar, moved the boat away from the jaws of the whale. Then Moby Dick came up above the surface of the water again and was facing Ahab's boat. But with evil cleverness, Moby Dick went under again and hit the boat with his head. His long, narrow jaw opened. He bit into the front of the boat with his mouth, and one of his teeth became stuck in the lock for an oar. Ahab's head was 6 inches from Moby Dick's mouth when the whale began to shake the boat gently, like a cat will do with a mouse in its mouth. Except for Fedallah, the rest of the crew ran and fell over each other to reach the back of the boat. Fedallah just sat there with his arms crossed. Ahab was crazy with anger. He grabbed at the mouth of the whale with his bare hands and tried to pull it apart. But this had no effect, and Moby Dick, as if making fun of Ahab's efforts, bit the boat completely in 2. The men had no choice but to jump into the water. Meanwhile, Moby Dick angrily circled the area, mixing and turning up the water. It looked like he was making himself ready for another deadly attack. The other boats were unharmed. They came nearby the destroyed boat, but they still did not dare to go near Ahab or the other crew members for fear of another attack by the whale. Luckily, the Pequod came between the whale and the swimming men. As Moby Dick swam away, the other boats flew to rescue Ahab and the men. Ahab was dragged into Stubb's boat. Even though he was soaking wet, he jumped to his feet and shouted, "Get your hands off me! Set the sail! Put the men behind the oars! We're going after that whale!" But Stubb's boat could not match the speed of the whale, even with the added men behind the oars. Moby Dick sped away into the ocean. Finally, everyone was back on board the Pequod. Ahab spoke again of the coin. "That gold is mine," he said. "I earned it today. But it's going to stay there until the white whale is dead. If any of you first sights the whale on the day he is killed, then the coin is yours. And if on that day I should again be the one to sight Moby Dick, then 10 times that sum shall be divided among all of you." After saying this, Ahab took his position on deck with his leg in the deck's hole. He stood there until dawn, sleeping and awakening himself from the most horrible dreams. This was the first day of hunting Moby Dick. Chapter 16. The second day's chase. The next day we heard the cry come again from the top of the mast. "There she blows! She blows! She blows! Right ahead!" "Yes, of course," cried Stubb. "That whale can't escape. Blow on and split your spout, oh whale! The mad devil himself is after you. Ahab is going to stop your blood like a guard shuts his gate at night. By now the excitement of hunting Moby Dick was felt among all the crew. Whatever fears or worries they felt before were no longer, gone in their growing respect for Ahab. Now there were 30 men working as one man toward the old captain's deadly goal. Ahab raised himself high in the mast to have a better look. No sooner did he arrive than a terrible cry was heard from the men on deck. Moby Dick was rapidly swimming toward the ship. We could see him jumping in and out of the ocean, tossing his entire body out of the water and high into the air. This was Moby Dick's signal for fighting us. "Swim to the sun for your last time, Moby Dick," cried Ahab. "Your time to die has come. I stand ready with my harpoon. Quick, the boats, stand by." Ahab came down from his perch and onto the deck. "Lower her into the ocean," he cried as soon as he had jumped into his boat. Moby Dick was now heading straight toward the 3 whaleboats. It seemed like he would be the first to attack. This time Ahab decided to go straight for the white whale's forehead, because a whale can see better from the side than from the front. But before they could reach him, Moby Dick came toward them at a terrible speed. He opened his jaws and splashed his tail, rushing among the boats. Even though there were irons darting into him from every boat, he continued to swim so that he crossed and tangled the lines. Soon, all harpoon lines were caught together. With the whale among all the caught lines, harpoons and lances, there was only one thing for Ahab to do: cut his line loose. As he was doing so, the white whale made a sudden rush toward Ahab's boat. Because of the lines, Moby Dick pulled the boats of Stubb and Flask towards him, causing them to crash into each other. All of the men in those boats fell into the sea. Then the whale went back under the sea and disappeared in a whirlpool. The men worriedly swam in the water, with Flask going up and down like an empty bottle, trying to hold his legs up in case the horrible jaws of the whale were under him. Stubb continued to call out to be taken up, even though none of the other boats wanted to go near where Moby Dick had disappeared. Ahab was about to go into the whirlpool to rescue them when his boat suddenly shot up from the sea into the air. It looked as if invisible lines were pulling it up to the sky. From underwater, Moby Dick had hit his broad forehead against the bottom of Ahab's boat. This made it spin over and over in the air. It landed upside down, and Ahab and his men swam from under it. This satisfied Moby Dick. He started to swim quickly away from the boats, still dragging those tangled lines behind him. The Pequod sailed quickly to the rescue and sent a boat for those crewmen in the water, their oars and their harpoons. Ahab was found holding on to his boat's broken half. Luckily, no one had died and there were only a few injuries. Back on the deck of the Pequod, Ahab had to hang on to Starbuck's shoulder. He had lost his ivory leg, and now only had a short, sharp stick for a leg. "I am untouched," he cried. "Give me that lance for a cane so I can walk. Then gather the men together." Ahab looked among the gathered crew for one man, Fedallah, but the Manilan was nowhere to be found. "Sir," said Stubb, "I saw him caught among the tangles of your line. I think he got dragged under when the whale went under the water." "My line? My line? Gone? Oh, no! That is a sign of death, my death!" cried Ahab. "Quick! Collect all irons and harpoons now. If I have to circle this world 10 times, or even go straight through it, I will kill Moby Dick." "Please," cried Starbuck. "You will never get him, old man. No more of this madness. You have chased him for 2 days, and for 2 days our boats have been broken to bits. You've even lost your own ivory leg and the life of one of your crew. These are enough warnings. Do you want to chase this whale until each of us is lying at the bottom of the sea?" "I have no choice," replied Ahab mysteriously. "It's said that drowning things always come up twice to the surface before dying. Then they rise the 3rd time only to sink forever. So it will be with Moby Dick. He's been for 2 days. Tomorrow will be the 3rd and his last. He'll rise once more only to spout his last." Then Ahab said to himself, "Fedallah had said he would die before me, but he said I would see him once again before I was to die. That's quite a mystery to explain, but I'll solve it."
Chapter 17. Fedallah's saying comes true. The next morning was calm. Ahab had placed his crew on every mast of the ship to serve as daylight lookouts. He had a wooden leg quickly made to replace his lost ivory one. Ahab was again raised up to the mast. Finally, after an hour of searching the sea, he saw the spout. 3 cries of "There she blows!" went up from the top of the masts. "Forehead to forehead, I meet you this 3rd time, Moby Dick," called Ahab. Then he spoke to the top of the mast lovingly, saying, "Goodbye, top of the mast. I'm going down to the ocean. Watch that whale while I'm down there. We'll talk tomorrow night, after the white whale is lying on the bottom of the sea." As Ahab was being lowered, Fedallah's mystery came back to him. He whispered to himself, "Fedallah said he would die before I did, but he also said I would see him again. But where and how? We're too far away from where he sank. No, Fedallah, maybe you were right about dying, but you were wrong about Ahab." Ahab, preparing to climb into his boat, turned to Starbuck and said, "Shake hands with me, man. I am old, very old." Starbuck's eyes filled with tears, and he begged, "Oh, my captain, do not go. A brave man weeps and begs you." "Lower my boat," cried Ahab, shaking Starbuck's arm from him. The boats had not gone far when a signal from the top of the mast told Ahab that the whale had gone down below again. Ahab cried, "Move on, move on! I'm not afraid. I'll be waiting for Moby Dick when he rises. Oh, Fedallah, you were wrong. No coffin or no hearse for me. Remember, only a rope can kill me. Ha ha!" Suddenly the waters around the boat started to move in broad circles. We could all hear a low sound like thunder. Everyone held their breaths in the silence. Then, suddenly, ropes, harpoons, and lances shot up from the sea with the mighty whale himself. Moby Dick, angry from the previous day's chase, came straight toward the boats. He hit his tail against the sides of the boats. As the whale turned and quickly swam by them again, a cry came out from the crews. There, tied to the whale's back, among the tangled ropes, was the half-torn body of Fedallah. His dead, opened eyes were turned upon old Ahab. Ahab dropped his harpoon and took in a long breath. "So what you said was true, Fedallah," he whispered. "I do see you again after your death. And what you said about your hearse was right, too. It's not from human hands, because it is Moby Dick. But where is my hearse?" Ahab looked at his restless crew.
"Sit down, men," he cried. "If you try to jump from this boat I'm in, I'll harpoon you. You are my crew. You are my arms and my legs, and so you will obey me. Now, where did Moby Dick go?"
Moby Dick was swimming away from the boats at top speed out to sea. Ahab gave the order to follow. As he passed the Pequod, Starbuck called down to him from the deck.
"Ahab, it is not too late to turn back. Look, Moby Dick is not after you. It is you that is madly after him."
But Ahab ordered his boat to continue to follow the whale. He could see Tashtego, Queequeg, and Dagu climbing to the top of 3 masts. He saw the oarsmen fixing the 2 damaged boats which were at the Pequod's side. He could even see from the ship's windows Stubb and Flask busily gathering new irons and lances below deck. But Ahab's oarsmen had other trouble besides the white whale. Sharks had gathered around his boat and were biting at the oars.
"Don't pay any attention to them," cried Ahab. "Row on."
"But, sir, the oars are growing smaller and smaller with their bites."
"They will last long enough to catch Moby Dick. Row on. Are these sharks expecting to feast on the whale or old Ahab?"
The crew was unable to see anything as they neared the white whale. The mist from his spout made it almost impossible to see. Then Ahab caught sight of Moby Dick's side. He bent his body back, and with both arms threw his special iron and his hate into the hated Moby Dick. The white whale twisted and rolled, hitting his side against the small boat. It turned partly over. 3 of Ahab's crew were tossed into the sea, but Ahab hung on and managed to stay inside the boat. Then the whale sped off into the sea. Ahab yelled to the men to make sure that the line connected to Moby Dick was held. But the line wasn't strong enough, and it broke in 2 in the empty air. As Moby Dick turned, he saw the back of the Pequod. Maybe, because he thought the ship was the cause of all his trouble and pain, he swam toward its approaching front with his jaws open, ready to strike.
"The whale! The ship!" cried the frightened crew. "The ship! The ship! Move! Move, O sea! Row on, my men! Will you not save my ship?" shouted Ahab wildly.
The men on board the Pequod started to shout and pray, their scared eyes on the white whale that was rushing straight toward them.
"Oh, Ahab!" cried Starbuck. "Look at what has happened because of your work. The whale comes for us. My God, please stand by me now. That laughing whale wants to eat us all."
In revenge, Moby Dick's white forehead smashed the ship's back end. The men fell flat on their faces from the crash, and then started to scream as huge streams of water began pouring in through the break.
"The second hearse! The Pequod is the second hearse made from American wood," cried Ahab from his boat. Yes, those were Fedallah's words. A hearse made from American wood.
As if happy with his act of revenge, the whale turned away from the sinking ship and dove under water again. It came quietly up a few feet away from Ahab's boat. He lay there, unmoving for a time.
"Oh, Pequod, my death ship, must you die and sink without me? Am I cut off from a captain's wish to die with my ship? How lonely is my death after such a lonely life. I look towards you, you all, destroying whale. You still have not beat me. To the last I shall fight you. In hate I shall take my last breath at you. Break me to pieces while I chase you, tied to you, damned whale. Thus I give up the spear," cried Ahab. With all the power left in him, Ahab threw the harpoon. It hit and stuck into Moby Dick, but the whale moved so quickly that the harpoon's line was tangled. Ahab bent down to untangle it, and the rope caught him around the neck. He flew out of the boat, pulled out by the rope. Before the crew knew what was happening, he was gone, killed by a rope. The crewmen stood still for an instant, as if in a dream. Then, turning toward the ship, they asked, "The ship! Great God, where is the Pequod?" Through the darkness they saw the Pequod sinking into the sea, the harpooner still hanging onto her high masts. Then a whirlpool of water grabbed hold of the ship and spun it around and around until all its crew, every oar, every lance pole, every floating piece of the Pequod, everything was carried to the bottom of the ocean. And the great white whale swam away, and the sea rolled on the same as it had been rolling for 5,000 years. Chapter 18. The Only Survivor. The story's finished, and I alone survived the wreck. As I was being dragged under the sea by the whirlpool, being pulled round and round toward the center, a black object shot up from the center. A coffin-shaped lifesaver shot out from the center and floated by my side. Even after death, my best friend had saved my life. It was Queequeg's coffin lifesaver. For 1 whole day and 1 whole night I floated on it. The sharks did not harm me as they swam by, and the wild seabirds flew over me with their mouths shut tightly. Floating all alone at sea, I had much to think about. I thought of Ahab going after his goal even though it meant death, and of the white whale's answer of revenge. The memory of Queequeg's kindness protected and kept my spirits alive, just as his coffin chest now kept my body above the sea. On the 2nd day I saw a ship's sail coming nearer and nearer. Seeing me in the water, she stopped to pick me up at last. It was the Rachel, still looking for her missing children. But instead she had found me, Ishmael, another missing child.